Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Welcome back for another episode. And today I'm thrilled to have with me Bryan Sillaman. Bryan's a partner at Hughes Hubbard in Paris. And I've had him on several pods. And today we're going to take a lengthy exploration of ESG from the European and EU perspective. So, Bryan, first of all, thanks so much for taking the time to visit with me, and welcome back to a podcast.
Yeah, thrilled to be back. Thank you. My pleasure.
So, Bryan, could you tell us a little bit about your current practice and really how did you go from being a white-collar defense lawyer to an ESG aficionado?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting evolution, and I think like a lot of people in this space, we've seen the definition of what falls into compliance expanding rapidly. And so, as you mentioned, I was initially focused on white-collar anti-corruption issues. I still do a lot of that work with clients in France, in the EU. But we've seen companies take a broader look at, what does compliance mean? How can we get ahead of regulatory issues that are coming down the pike? And obviously, with all of the focus and attention on ESG, that's sort of made for a natural transition. So we've got a team here in Paris, as well as our team in DC that are looking at these issues.
So what would you say are some of the key differences in the regulatory approach to ESG between the EU and the United States?
Yeah, I think one difference is the EU has been at this maybe a little bit longer. So it's not as new of a topic, although it's been, rebranded as ESG. It came in different forms, whether you're talking about human rights or sort of duty of care laws. But there have been disclosure-related obligations in the EU going back to 2014 that required at least the largest companies to report on human rights, environmental risks in connection with their activities. So in that sense, the EU's maybe a bit ahead of where the U.S. is, but the U.S. is obviously catching up quite quickly, and we anticipate there to be more disclosure requirements coming out of the U.S. But another difference is that they have formed at the EU Commission level a technical working group that's really digging into the details and really issuing detailed guidance on what it means to engage in sustainable activities. And we can talk a little bit about how that's coming out in different forms, but there's a very robust and rigorous exercise at a scientific and technical level to try to define what is sustainable activity versus not. And obviously, as you could probably guess, that generates a lot of different opinions, different viewpoints. So it's been a lengthy process in the EU, but a lot has come out in 2021, and we expect a lot more in 2022.
Bryan, one of my observations has been that at least the prior administration was not a fan of ESG. The current administration, I think, has a different view, but they've yet to put a regulatory framework in place. And that's left corporations to really drive the ESG discussion in the United States, as opposed to the EU, which, as you noted, had regulatory frameworks and a wide variety of ESG topics in place. And now we're seeing some consolidation at the commission level. Would that be a fair assessment from where you sit?
I think that is a fair assessment. I do think the EU has been ahead a bit on the regulatory front. I would say that we've also seen from some of our clients and large companies that they do also face the same sort of investor pressure as well. A lot of the large asset managers, the BlackRocks, State Street, Vanguard, are investors in the largest, at least, EU and European companies as well. And so in addition to the regulatory requirements that the EU is issuing, they're also getting the investor pressure. But I think you're right to say that the regulatory process is driving more in the EU than it has, at least to date, in the US.
Bryan, I did a little bit of research prior to this podcast, and I was really surprised to see the breadth and scope of some of the regulatory frameworks already in place. And I'm not sure our American audience is as familiar with them as you might be. So could I ask you, what is the Green Taxonomy and how does that relate to an overall ESG program?
Yeah, the taxonomy is a really interesting tool, and it continues to be, even as recently as the end of the year, debated and discussed quite vigorously among the member states. The idea of the taxonomy was to define what are sustainable activities from an economic perspective. And the concern was, companies claiming to be involved in sustainable activities, but not really being involved. And it comes back to the concern of greenwashing. And so the taxonomy set out to define at a technical and scientific level what is sustainable and what is not. And it defined that in 6 categories. So there's 6 environmental objectives. There's climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, the sustainable use of protection of water, transition to a circular economy, pollution prevention, and the protection of biodiversity. So for each of those 6 categories, there will be technical criteria that define whether an economic activity is sustainable or not. To put that into into an example, if you're engaged in the production of cement and you do that within a threshold of CO2 emissions that's below a certain threshold, you can claim that that production process is aligned with the taxonomy. If it's above the threshold, you can't. If you're constructing buildings and those buildings have an energy efficiency level that's below a certain technical threshold, you can claim that those are aligned with the taxonomy. If you're not, then you can't. And so it's a very detailed framework. There have been criteria issued for the first 2 of the 6 that I mentioned, so climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. And companies, large companies, and ultimately financial market participants will have to eventually report on whether and how much of their activity is aligned with these taxonomies. One of the biggest debates, which came really at the end of this year, is what falls into these different buckets and what should be considered as sustainable or not. And the debate most recently has focused around inclusion or not of natural gas activities, companies that are involved in production of natural gas, and nuclear. And there are some member states who consider that those should be included as sustainable activities, and some who think quite vigorously that they should not. So it's really an evolving framework, and I think we'll see a lot more discussion and debate about that in the year to come.
So what is the Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulation, and how does that work into an overall ESG framework?
Yeah, so that works into the framework that requires disclosure by what are called financial market participants. So the taxonomy, if you think of it as the underlying basis for determining whether a certain activity is sustainable or not, the sustainable finance disclosure requirements then require asset managers, financial market participants to disclose how much of their activities first are aligned with the taxonomy, but then how they go about integrating ESG criteria into either the creation of financial products or their investment approach. And so those will apply to the finance sector and will require them to report against different criteria and define, how they integrate ESG into their decision-making process. If they're marketing a product that is ESG friendly, they have to define how they've done that and what the criteria are that went into it. So it's really focused on the finance industry.
And then the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, how does that fit in?
Yeah, so that's a similar reporting/disclosure directive requirement that relates to corporates. So if you think of large companies, and as I mentioned, there have been disclosure obligations for the largest European companies since 2014. What the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, would do would replace and enhance those existing disclosure requirements. And the idea there is to provide more detail to the market on what companies are doing to integrate ESG into their operations, and also to expand the number of companies that would be subject to those disclosure requirements. So currently, under the NFRD, the existing framework, there's approximately 11,000 companies that are subject to it. If the enhanced framework goes through, there would be around 50,000. So it would expand the pool of companies that have to report against these standards. And the idea being there, with more disclosure, with more information about how companies or financial institutions are making their sustainability decisions, that will help drive investment in a clearer way.
Brian, at the a little bit earlier in this podcast, you talked about the work really at the EU Commission level around ESG. And I wanted to maybe circle back to that now that we have these more specific reporting standards and directives defined. Is how do you see, or where do you see the EU Commission leading this? And will there continue to be refinements by the technical working commissions?
There will be. These are not intended to be static requirements. It's very much envisioned that the technical criteria will evolve over time. And so the technical working group issues its report into the commission, and then the commission decides, what ultimately makes it into the taxonomy. But it's very much intended to be an evolving set of standards, and that's to take into account technologies that may evolve and that we may not even know about, or that may contribute to environmental practices in a certain way over time. And also, it's just a very time-consuming process. So as I mentioned, there's only been technical criteria issued so far for the first 2 of the 6 environmental objectives. So those will continue to be issued in years to come. But it's very much going to be, I think, a living and breathing criteria.
So, Ryan, also a little bit earlier in the podcast, we talked about the difference in focus perhaps from the United States and the EU, at least in the private sector. And I wanted to ask, are you seeing in the private sector in Europe and in the EU, whether that be private equity companies, whether it be institutional investors, whether it be employees, whether it be banks or even insurance companies, do you see those groups as also driving, if not the discussion around ESG, actual business decisions as well?
Yes, I do. I think that ESG has become really a top of mind issue for a lot of companies and a lot of institutions, and I think part of that's driven by the regulatory framework, but even more so, companies are facing pressure from their investors, from their employees, from unions, from NGOs. There are a lot of different stakeholders, and we can talk about some of the actions by NGOs, but there are a lot of different stakeholders who are putting pressure, particularly but not only on companies involved in the energy industry, fossil fuel industry, financial industry, to do more and to disclose more and to communicate more about how they're contributing to the energy transition and to sustainability. So the pressure is coming from a lot of different areas, as I think it is in the U.S. And we've seen that filtering down to companies really of all levels and sizes.
Now, maybe if I could turn to ask you to put on your prognostication hat, or if you follow Johnny Carson, Carnac the Magnificent. What are some of the key trends that you're following for 2022? And then maybe lead that into what kinds of questions are you getting from clients now?
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting trends, I think, in addition to just sort of following what the rulemaking and regulatory process is. There have been some interesting lawsuits. There was a case brought against Shell in the Netherlands, which was decided in 2021 and brought by an NGO, a branch of Friends of the Earth. And at least at the initial court's level ruling, they decided against Shell and ordered Shell to decrease its CO2 emissions by 45% by 2030 compared to 2019 levels. Now, Shell has said they will appeal. Shell has also said they're very committed to the energy transition and reducing their CO2 emissions, but does not agree with the court's decision. But you'll see, I think, more of these type of duty of care cases brought against companies. We've seen similar examples in France, which has the devoir de vigilance law, or the duty of care law, which have provided primarily NGOs with an avenue to at least pursue reductions in carbon emissions and potentially even damages against companies. So I think on the litigation front, you're going to likely see more of those type of cases in certain jurisdictions.
The NGO front is quite interesting. That is one area that is really not as active in the United States, I would say. So you said that NGOs are playing a role in Europe and the EU. How do you see them playing out in addition to the litigation advocacy you just articulated?
In addition to litigation, I think they can be at least very powerful proponents of change. And we've seen there is a need at the company level often to engage with them in some form, and some of that's driven by employees who also feel similarly that companies should their own employers should be doing more. But we've seen, the NGOs, by giving them standing to bring suit, in some cases at least, them pursuing, the litigation front, and also working with unions, working with employees to help generate groundswell support for different sustainability initiatives. So I think we'll continue to see that. And another area that I think is ripe for further evolution is on the supply chain front. We've seen a number of countries pass enhanced disclosure and due diligence requirements on the supply chain and what companies operating in their jurisdiction are required to do. A lot of this is focused on human rights issues. So we have the Olympics coming up in China. There's been a lot of attention surrounding companies that are sponsoring the Olympics or doing business there, but certainly not only China. I think there's a lot of focus on how is material being sourced, how are products being made, where are they being made, are companies doing anything to assure themselves that there are not human rights abuses within the supply chain. And so Germany quite recently passed an enhanced due diligence law for large German companies that will require them to do due diligence, to report on it. Switzerland passed a similar disclosure law. They rejected a stronger law that could have held companies responsible for human rights abuses in their supply chain, but they still passed this disclosure law. So I think that's another area we're likely to see further evolution on both the disclosure and regulatory front, and potentially lawsuit litigation front as well.
Right, in the United States, when employees are active in ESG issues, it tends to be in the sustainability or the S part. It started, I think, with George Floyd's death and a wider discussion about diversity and inclusion in sustainability. Do you see that similarly in the EU, or are employees interested in different issues and those sort of human rights and social issues we tend to see in the U.S.?
I think there's some similarity. I do think the S, or the social aspect, gets a good bit of attention, perhaps not as much as the environmental, the E piece, but we tend to see more of it focused on gender issues, balance of men and women on the boards or in senior management. And there are some jurisdictions that have a requirement for a certain number of women to be on the board of directors, for example. In some countries, France being an example, it's difficult. In fact, it's prohibited to ask about race, and so that frames the diversity question in a different way. And so you can't, companies are not allowed to conduct surveys and poll their employees about their race. So it frames things in a different way. I do think there's focus on it and a genuine interest in having diverse viewpoints and diverse employee populations, but it might frame how the ESG program is structured and how the reporting is done in that respect.
Brian, what are maybe two or three of the top areas of questions or inquiry you're getting from clients today?
Yeah, a lot of the questions, there are companies who are some companies who are fairly, far down the road in this respect, even though it's very much evolving. But there are a lot of organizations that are just trying to get their head around what does ESG really mean, and more specifically, what does it mean for us as a company? And so some of the questions relate to the different regulatory frameworks, but also the frameworks put out by organizations like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, the SASB, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, and how these different frameworks fit in or relate to each other, and what should we be doing as an organization to try to get our heads around this. And so what we tend to try to counsel them is first to figure out who are the key stakeholders. ESG is such a broad issue or set of issues that it naturally implicates a lot of different stakeholders within the company. Those could be lawyers, finance professionals, but also HR, HSE. All of these different viewpoints and voices are going to be relevant to what the company ultimately decides. So figuring out who are the key stakeholders, and also where does this sit from a management perspective? Who's the sort of leader of this effort? And then what are the key issues facing us as an organization? The type of ESG issues that a traditional oil and gas or energy company is going to be faced with or want to address as priorities are probably going to be different from a tech company, which may be more focused on things surrounding data privacy and data security and safeguarding of information. So, figuring out what are the key, at least primary ESG issues for us as an organization, and then going about developing an approach to tackling those.
Are there any other groups? I guess I was intrigued by the labor unions because typically in the United States, it's much lower rate of unionization, but they tend to be focused really on the base issues, wages, working conditions. Do you have a impartial arbitration process, things like that? Is it different in the EU with regard to labor unions and ESG?
Yeah, the unions, I would say, and maybe it's a generalization, but I think it's probably an apt one. I think the unions tend to be stronger in the EU than in the US, and that varies by country for sure. Germany, France tend to have fairly powerful unions, often with representation on the board, and so there are requirements in some jurisdictions to have an employee representative on the board or represented within different management committees, and so that gives a voice to the unions that may not exist in the same way in the U.S. And I do think you see, both unions and employees generally speaking up about these issues. I know there are, particularly the younger generation is very concerned about climate change, and not just climate change, but social issues as well. And so that's affecting how companies go about their activities. If they want to recruit the best and brightest talent, I think they realize that they have to speak to these issues, and so it has driven a lot more communication and engagement with the employee population.
One of the things that I try to counsel companies on is that you're actually doing a lot of ESG now. You just don't call it that, and you don't look at it that way. You may not report on it in a way that needs to be reported. When a company comes to me and says, "Where do we start?" I try to encourage them to start seeing what they're already doing, whether that be in the human relations, whether that be in corporate governance, whether that be in their board composition, or a wide variety of other issues. Do you have those similar conversations with new clients or even existing clients?
Yeah, absolutely. And I completely agree. I think a lot of this has been, I don't want to minimize the nature of the ESG movement, because I think it has taken a dramatic turn in the past couple of years. But I agree that companies have been doing some of, if not a lot of this in some respects. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't improve, and perhaps that's really the goal is, more measurement, more disclosure is going to drive companies to improve. But if you think of HSE issues, reporting workplace safety issues, or water treatment, or waste, a lot of that's measured, and a lot of that's measured because it has to be at a local, national, jurisdictional level. And so part of this effort is, I agree, bringing those voices, bringing those stakeholders together, figuring out how does that information, first of all, are we capturing all that we can and should be capturing, but how does it fit into, and how can it fit and be communicated through these different frameworks, is really a lot of an important part of this exercise.
So, Brian, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I was wondering if our listeners wanted any more information on the topics we've touched upon today, the ESG practice that you, if not lead, are certainly a significant part of at Hughes Hubbard, or even to get in contact with you, what would be the best way to do so?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. The best way, I'm on LinkedIn, so feel free to find me on LinkedIn or through the Hughes Hubbard website. We have a number of articles that we've posted on these type of issues on our website, and some more to come in the near future. So be happy to hear from anyone.
Well, I look forward to your articles, and I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me for this podcast.
Thank you. Always a pleasure. Appreciate it.